This is what it was really like to wake up in a Victorian bedroom, where the air felt slightly damp before you even opened your eyes. The fire in the grate has gone cold overnight, leaving only a heap of pale gray ash. Your blankets are heavy but thinly worn, the quilt stitched decades ago by some aunt you never met. It smells faintly of lavender and old wool. Outside, somewhere down the lane, a milk cart rattles. The sound comes and goes in waves, muffled by the fog that presses in against the window panes. You stretch, slowly, in the narrow bed. The mattress dips more on one side, a hollow your body has carved over years. You glance at the small dressing table, the glass is clouded, as though it has absorbed a lifetime of candle smoke. A porcelain basin waits, the water inside gathered from the pump last night. It's icy now, a thin skin of cold hovering over its surface. You pull on your shirt, the cotton creased from drying too close to the hearth. There is the familiar sound of the maid, moving about downstairs, a careful clatter of crockery, the muffled thump of bread dough meeting a floured board. You know what will be on the table soon enough. Porridge thickened with barley, a slice of yesterday's loaf, perhaps a little butter if the week has been good, and tea, always tea. You also know what will not be there. There will be no bright, glossy tomatoes in a bowl, no slices laid beside the eggs. You have never expected them. In this house, tomatoes are not food, they are, at best, something to grow in a corner of the garden for show, or at worst, a dangerous novelty meant for reckless souls. The idea of eating one feels vaguely wrong, though you could not quite explain why. You have heard your uncle call them love apples, which sounds more like a jest than a name. The vicar once referred to them as poison globes. Even the gardener will not touch them, though he grows nearly everything else under the sun. Historically, you know because your cousin once insisted on reading aloud from some agricultural journal that tomatoes belong to the nightshade family, the same family as deadly belladonna. This fact alone has been enough for many in your acquaintance to keep their distance. Victorians, after all, do not eat deadly things for breakfast. You sit at the small table by the window, gazing out at the pale garden, where frost still clings to the edges of the cabbage leaves. Somewhere beyond the kitchen wall, the tomato vines hang heavy, their red fruit gleaming like glass marbles. A fringe fact you once overheard from the apothecary comes back to you that some folk think tomatoes are useful only for polishing brass, their acid better suited to metal than to the stomach. Whether that is true or not, no one here has ever tested it. And as you sip your first mouthful of tea, hot and tannic, you wonder briefly if perhaps all the talk is nonsense. Then you push the thought away. Historians still argue whether the Victorian distrust of tomatoes was rooted in genuine cases of poisoning from lead in pewter plates, or whether it was simply a lingering superstition born of botanical caution. For now, it is enough to eat your porridge in peace, while the red orbs outside ripen and drop silently into the grass, untouched. You step outside into the pale, damp morning air, the sort that seems to soak through your coat before you've even fastened the last button. The grass underfoot is wet with a thin frost, not the sharp kind that crunches, but the soft, wet kind that leaves your boots damp. The kitchen garden stretches ahead, neat rows divided by narrow paths of packed earth. You know each bed by heart. Carrots still in the ground, turnips nearly ready, onions pulled and hanging in the shed to dry. And then there's the far corner, the tomato patch. The plants are tall and spindly now, their vines tied to stakes with rough twine. Red fruit hangs heavily among the curling leaves, some smooth and flawless, others split from the cold. They look almost like ornaments, bright against the dull greens and browns of the autumn garden. You don't go any closer than the path. No one ever does unless it's to clip away the dead leaves or gather a few specimens to place on the windowsill for show. They are admired but not eaten. It's a curious sort of plant, grown for beauty, not for the table. The gardener, Mr. Hemsley, emerges from the shed with his cap pulled low, a spade over one shoulder. He nods in greeting but says nothing at first. His eyes follow yours to the tomato plants. Pretty enough, he says finally, but not worth the trouble in the pot. You've heard him say as much before. He believes, as many do, that tomatoes are too sharp for the stomach, especially in the damp climate here. A more eccentric neighbor once claimed that tomatoes are best left alone because they can draw down the humors and cause fevers. You don't entirely understand what that means, and you doubt he does either. Still, the phrase has lodged in your mind, resurfacing whenever you see the plants heavy with fruit. It's not as though no one has ever eaten them here, you've heard rumors of it. A retired sea captain who spent years in the Mediterranean swore by tomatoes, eating them with salt and olive oil. He's been dead for some years now, but people still murmur that his heart gave out sooner than it ought, and perhaps it was the tomatoes that hastened it. No one can say for certain. You walk slowly along the edge of the garden, hands clasped behind your back, pretending not to notice the pull of color from the tomato vines. A few have fallen to the ground, their skins split open to show the watery flesh inside. The hens have no qualms about pecking at them, though you notice they never seem to finish one entirely. Whether it's taste or instinct that stops them, you can't tell. A passing fact, repeated more than once in the drawing room, comes to you now. In some parts of the world, tomatoes are used not in cooking but as decorative table pieces, sometimes alongside flowers. There are even painted plates featuring tomatoes that sit in parlors where no one would dare eat them. Historians still argue whether this ornamental treatment was born of genuine fear or simply fashioned the way pineapples were once displayed but rarely consumed, a sign of status more than sustenance. In your own home, it seems the matter is not worth debating. Tomatoes are grown, admired, perhaps even painted, but they are not tasted. You turn back toward the house, the sound of the kitchen door opening carrying faintly on the air. Breakfast is ready. The smell of bread and something faintly meaty drifts toward you, reassuring in its familiarity. Behind you, the tomato vines sway slightly in the breeze, their red fruit catching the light in a way that makes them look almost edible. Almost. You step back into the kitchen, the shift from damp garden air to the warm, yeasty heat almost startling. The range hums quietly with its low fire, a pot of porridge simmering to a slow, thick bubble. The table is set with care mismatched cups and saucers, a sugar bowl with its tiny silver spoon, and a loaf of bread still radiating the faintest heat from the oven. At the far counter, Cook is busy with her knife, chopping onions into neat, sharp-smelling piles. She does not look up immediately. She is too intent on her work. You watch the rhythmic movement of the blade, the sound of it tapping the board in an even, unfaltering beat. It's only when she sweeps the onions into a bowl that she glances your way. "You kept out of the tomato patch, I hope," she says, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone stating the obvious. She has never trusted them. Once, years ago, a houseguest brought her a basket of ripe tomatoes, insisting they made an excellent pie filling. She threw the whole lot into the pig trough, convinced they were dangerous. The pigs, she claims, lived another 7 years, but she still sees that as proof that pigs will eat anything. Today she is making a hearty onion and barley stew, seasoned with thyme and a pinch of black pepper. The scent is savory and grounded, the sort of smell that makes the air feel heavier in the most comforting way. She drops a handful of chopped carrots into the pot with a small splash of broth, giving it all a gentle stir. You take your seat at the small table tucked into the corner, watching her move from counter to range with the efficiency of long habit. Above the range, on a high shelf, sits a row of glass jars, pickled onions, preserved gooseberries, and one jar that stands out. It holds whole tomatoes, suspended in a cloudy brine. Cook notices your gaze and says simply, "For polishing the brass." She doesn't elaborate. It's not entirely a joke. You've heard from more than one neighbor that the acid in tomatoes will brighten metal better than any purchased cleaner. Whether it's a true method or a kitchen superstition is hard to say. In this house, the jar has never been opened for anything but the candlesticks. Somewhere in the pantry, the kitchen maid is clattering about, her footsteps quick and light. You catch a whisper of a tune, something bright and out of place in the stillness of the morning. Cook ignores it, focusing instead on tasting her stew, pursing her lips as she judges the balance of flavors. You sip your tea and glance toward the small window that looks out onto the garden. From here, you can see a corner of the tomato patch. Even at this distance, the color of the fruit is vivid, like drops of sealing wax against the green. You find yourself wondering, not for the first time, what they might taste like if Cook ever relented. Sweet? Sharp? Both at once? Historians still argue whether Victorian cooks avoided tomatoes purely out of health concerns, or whether the absence was also a matter of habit and tradition, a kitchen culture that prized certain ingredients and ignored others. In some households, perhaps, the fear of the unfamiliar was just as strong as any belief about poison. Cook ladles out the porridge, sets down the bread, and joins you briefly, though she remains standing. You take the first spoonful slowly, the heat of it filling your mouth, the mild flavor settling you into the rhythm of the day. Outside, the tomatoes stay on their vines, gleaming, waiting, and untouched. You make your way to the market by the same route you always take, following the seam of cobbles where wagon wheels have worried the stones into shallow grooves. The morning is cool enough that your breath shows for a moment and then disappears. Stalls are already busy. Fish laid out on crushed ice that looks like ground glass, greens in tidy heaps, apples waxed with a sleeve until they shine. You move at an easy pace, comfortable with the familiar drift of voices, vendors calling softly, customers answering with numbers and coins. You pause by the bread stall first. Loaves are stacked like bricks. Cottage loaves with their little caps. Long brown sticks crusted hard enough to rasp your fingertips. You buy one, wrap it in paper, and tuck it under your arm. The baker's boy nods as if you are part of the scenery. You are. People who come early and buy the same things become part of the morning. Past the bread, you skirt the fishmonger. He is trimming a cod and telling a story about the storm last night that you did not hear because you were asleep. You nod anyway. The smell of fish fades, replaced by onions, then by pears, and then abruptly by the faint, greenish scent of something resinous. You are near the tomato stall. You did not intend to be, but the aisle bends and brings you there. The fruit sits in shallow wicker baskets, rounded and bright, the color of sealing wax and postbox paint. The man behind the stall stands with his hands clasped. He looks patient in the way of someone who has learned to wait. A small painted sign reads, "Love apples." You have seen the sign before. You have ignored it before. He does not call out to you. He knows better than to waste his voice on shoppers who walk a wider circle around his corner than they need to. You hold yourself a little straighter and keep your distance. Tomatoes look fine from afar, you tell yourself. They always do. Smooth skins, a faint bloom, the suggestion that a knife would slide through without resistance. A few have been cut open and set on a plate, seeds glistening like tiny lanterns. The plate is pewter. You notice this without meaning to. Someone once said that tomatoes draw the lead out of pewter, that the acid invites the metal into the sauce, the way rain invites muck into shoes. You have no experiments of your own to offer, only the memory of the warning. A woman ahead of you asks the price of cucumbers, and then glances at the tomatoes with a small, secret interest. The vendor brightens and says they are fresh that morning, grown under glass to keep the chill from the vines. He says the word glass again, as though it is proof of manners and safety. The woman hesitates, then buys cucumbers anyway. You understand her logic because you share it. The cucumbers are quiet. The tomatoes are not. You move on. The apple seller offers you a taste of a russet. You accept, bite, and find the flesh dry and sweet. You buy two. You exchange a few coins and receive change that is still warm from the seller's palm. This is how the market works. Small exchanges, small comforts, the reliable traffic of need and supply. You are not here to make a point. You are here to fill a pantry. Still, you find your eyes sliding back to the tomato stall. The vendor has produced a little leaflet. He hands it to a younger man in a felt hat. You can read the title upside down, Italian Receipts for the Table. The word receipts sits where recipes might someday live. The younger man smiles as if he has stumbled onto something foreign in a friendly way. You consider whether you should feel that too and decide to let the thought pass. A mainstream fact drifts up from memory. Tomatoes are a species of nightshade, cousin to deadly things with purple flowers and blackberries. This is what people repeat when they need reasons. It satisfies most listeners. Nightshade is a big word, and big words are useful when a simple "no thank you" feels thin. You have noticed that the word is often enough to close a conversation. A curious tidbit follows close behind it. An acquaintance once confessed she set sliced tomatoes on her windowsill to keep moths from nibbling lace. She was certain the smell repelled them. Whether it worked or she merely liked the look of the slices catching light through seed and pulp, you never knew. She called the result pretty housekeeping. It felt like a compromised tomatoes used as guardians of cloth rather than as food. You select carrots from a barrel, dirt flaking off into the air like paper dust. The greengrocer praises their sweetness and suggests a stew. He does not mention tomatoes. No one ever does unless they have a reason to cause a discussion. You notice a jar of dried herbs near his elbow and think how often flavor is coaxed from leaves, from little seeds, from roots. A red fruit could do the same, you imagine. But imagination is not the same as appetite. At the far end of the aisle, children linger, fingers hooked over the lip of a crate as if it were a fence at a fair. One of them points at the cut tomatoes on the pewter plate and makes a face for his companions. They laugh quietly in that way children do when they think they are being wicked by proxy. You feel unreasonably relieved that none of them is handed a slice. Good sense, you think, is sometimes the absence of an experiment. You buy onions, a cabbage, and a small wedge of cheese. You weigh the cheese in your hand, judge its firmness, and approve its modesty. You like modest food on cool mornings. A stallholder offers you a sprig of thyme as a little kindness, and you slip it into your pocket. Its smell will follow you for the rest of the day, making you feel capable. When you turn toward the lane again, you pass the tomato stall one last time. The vendor meets your eye and lifts his chin toward the plate. You shake your head gently. He shrugs, not offended, and arranges the slices into a neater fan. He is good at arranging. The market teaches arrangement to those who wait. Historians still argue whether fear of tomatoes owed more to genuine illness from contaminated utensils and glazes, or to the slow, stubborn caution of kitchens that trusted root and grain over bright, wet fruit. The records offer hints and advertisements, recipes that appear and disappear, lectures in halls where men cleared their throats and compared notes. But the market tells its own story in coins and leftovers. Today, the story is simple. The red bowls remain full. You walk home the way you came, carrying bread, onions, carrots, cabbage, a wedge of cheese, a sprig of thyme. Your bag is ordinary and commendable. Your steps are steady. Behind you, the market continues to do what markets do. It offers. It waits. It closes. Tomatoes gleam on a pewter plate, the morning light making their seeds look like tiny lamps. You do not look back again. You set the kettle on and listen to the small, patient sounds that belong to mornings. The soft tick of contracting metal as the range takes the heat, the faint hiss where a seam lets out a thread of steam, the quiet shuffle of your own feet while you decide where to put your hands. Tea first, always tea. It is the dependable ritual, a way of making the day slide into place without scraping. The caddy waits on the shelf, dented and honest. When you lift the lid, the dry leaves give off a smell like clean paper and winter wood. You measure a spoonful that you could find in the dark. The spoon clicks on the rim of the pot. You like that sound because it belongs to you alone, a sign that you are careful in small matters. Water follows, not boiling, not timid, just at the edge where it begins to talk. The leaves lift and turn as if surprised to be asked to work again. You place the lid and set the pot near the warmest corner of the hob. 4 minutes, 5, perhaps 6 if the morning asks for patience. When you pour, the stream runs a brown that seems thin at first, and then strengthens as it gathers in the cup. A faint bloom forms on top, not scum, though people call it that, but a quiet film that proves the water here is heavy with minerals. You know to stir and break it. You add a little milk. It folds into the tea without ceremony, clouding and then settling into a soft, useful color. Sugar stands in its bowl for company, but you leave it alone today. You drink slowly because tea rewards that. Heat finds your tongue and then your throat, and you feel yourself assemble from the inside. The first swallow promises that the day will be manageable. Your chest loosens a fraction. Your hands forget whatever they were planning to fret about. You take another sip and discover that the world has agreed to be ordinary for a quarter of an hour. This is long enough. On the table, next to the cup, lies yesterday's paper folded to the adverts. There is a notice for a new tonic that claims to correct the acidity of the blood. You glance at the word acidity and think, not for the first time, about tomatoes. People are fond of explaining their dislike of them by saying they are too sharp, that they unsettle the stomach and heat the temper. Tea, by comparison, is described as bracing in the correct way, the friendly kind of bitter that sets a person right. It helps that tea has been given a national blessing. A mainstream fact is easy to state. By the 19th century, tea is ordinary in Britain, common in kitchens, wealthy and plain, taken with milk, often with sugar, and recognized as the drink of the day. You could repeat this in your sleep. You lift the pot and pour again. A shorter cup to test the strength. You hold the china to your cheek for a second, because the warmth feels good and because no one is watching. While you drink, you practice the quiet arithmetic of domestic comfort. One hot cup now, one later when the post arrives, one in the late afternoon when the light loses its color. 3 cups make a day feel like a line with knots at sensible intervals. On the mantel sits a small saucer where you sometimes set used leaves to dry. It is not wasteful, it is practical. A neighbor once told you that when the leaves are completely dry, they can be sprinkled on the carpet just before sweeping to catch dust, or tucked into a corner of a cupboard to keep musty smells away. A quirky tidbit, perhaps, but it works well enough to keep trying, and the act pleases you. The leaves look industrious, even when finished with their primary task. The kettle sighs. You move it aside and wipe the rim with a folded cloth. You have learned not to leave water standing in the iron too long. Everything rusts faster than you think. Outside the window, the garden is colorless in the weak light, except for that patch of unwavering red. Tomatoes keep their brightness no matter what the sky is doing. They hold the eye the way a warning flag does, calmly, stubbornly. You find yourself watching them while you drink, safe at a distance, participating in a conversation you are not obliged to finish. Your stomach feels friendly now, warmed into cooperation. You let a heel of bread meet a bit of butter and make a small sandwich of nothing in particular. Tea improves bread. You are sure of this. You have read that some prefer lemon to milk, that others brew their leaves darker and insist sugar is the proper way to make tea honest. All of that is noise. Your cup is correct for you. You like it because it asks nothing clever. The paper offers a column about vegetables, newly esteemed by fashionable tables. Tomatoes appear in the list, followed by a sentence that sounds like a shrug in print, to be taken cautiously. You imagine the author making a face he believes to be scientific. Historians still argue whether such warnings were driven by medical anxieties, the habit of diagnosing foods by humors and acids, or by older suspicions carried forward from botany lectures about nightshades, or by the very practical problem of lead in pewter and certain glazes that a sour fruit might coax into a sauce. The records are a patchwork of sermons, advertisements, recipes, and scolding letters. No single thread explains the whole cloth. You pour the last half cup from the pot and find it has grown stout and a touch astringent. You take it anyway. Strong tea tells you to stand up straighter. You do. The room smells better now. Steam, malt from the bread, a ribbon of tannin in the air, and a suggestion of clean hearth. The day feels like a reasonable proposition. You rinse the pot with hot water, swish it in a small circle, and turn it upside down to dry. You never use soap in it. The pot remembers what it is for and does not need to be told too forcefully. On the way to the scullery, your eye catches the brass candlesticks waiting for their weekly attention. You think of the jar on the high shelf in the kitchen, tomatoes suspended in cloudy liquid like red buoys in gray water. You imagine, without quite intending to, polishing the brass with a slice and watching the metal wake up to a clean, yellow shine. It would be satisfying work, though it would also mean opening that jar and inviting the smell into the room. You decide to leave the job for tomorrow, when windows can be opened wider. Your cup sits empty on the table, leaving a faint ring that you wipe away with the edge of your sleeve. Tea leaves rest in their caddy once more, the spoon tucked inside like a bookmark in a familiar chapter. The morning moves on. The tomato patch keeps its distance and its color. You have had what you needed. Heat in a small porcelain bowl. Bitterness domesticated by milk. A reason not to consider anything else too closely. You fasten your cuffs and smooth your collar. A second cup later will be exactly the same as the first. This promise is the real comfort. You can live a long while on repeated assurances. Outside, a cart rolls past. Inside, a clock reaches for the half hour. You glance at the red fruit in the corner of your eye, and then lower your gaze to the ordinary floorboards that do not argue about anything. Tea has done its work. The bell on the front gate gives a single, hollow chime, not quite a knock, not quite a summons, but enough to send you to the window. Outside, standing in the gray light, is your physician. His tall hat tilts slightly to one side, either from the wind or from long habit. He carries a leather bag whose corners have worn into soft curves. When you open the door, he steps inside without waiting for you to invite him. This is the way of men who have been in and out of every house in the parish for decades. He removes his hat, shakes the damp from its brim, and takes a seat in the small parlor as if it were his own. Routine visit, he says, though you cannot remember requesting one. You know better than to ask why. A doctor's version of routine often includes satisfying his own curiosity about the health of his patients, whether or not they asked. He sets his bag on the table and fusses with the latches. The smell of his gloves, leather warmed by the hand, reaches you before anything else. Inside the bag are the usual instruments: a stethoscope, a thermometer, a notebook with its pages foxed at the edges. He asks after your sleep, your appetite, your digestion, all in the same voice one might use to inquire about the weather. You answer truthfully enough, which is to say you choose truths that require no further questions. Sleep, fair; appetite, steady; digestion, untroubled. You sip from the cup you had set aside, the last of the morning's tea now gone tepid. He notices but says nothing. As the questions settle, he leans back slightly in his chair. You don't take tomatoes, do you? The question drops into the room like a coin into deep water. You shake your head once. He nods, apparently satisfied. Quite right, he says, and launches into a lecture on tropical nightshades, how they are said to stir the blood and agitate the mind. A mainstream fact emerges in his telling. By the mid-19th century, certain medical circles classified tomatoes as an excitant, a food that could inflame not just the body but the temperament. He quotes a line from some journal about overheating the humors, a phrase he seems to enjoy rolling around in his mouth. Then comes the anecdote. A patient of his, prone to headaches, had begun eating tomatoes in soup, as the Italians do, and soon found himself beset by restless nights and peculiar dreams. The man gave up the habit, and according to the doctor returned to sound sleep. The cause and effect are presented as obvious, though you are not entirely convinced. You remember, too, a fringe tidbit you once overheard at the apothecary. Some claimed that tomato skins, if not properly removed, could cling to the lining of the stomach for days, refusing to pass. The image has stayed with you longer than it should, though whether it is true or not is another matter entirely. The doctor closes his bag and stands. Best to keep your constitution as it is, he says, adjusting his hat in the hall. He seems pleased to have confirmed that you are not among the tomato-eating set. He leaves without accepting tea, stepping back into the fog with the briskness of a man who has other calls to make. Historians still argue whether physicians genuinely believed in the physiological dangers of tomatoes or whether they were merely echoing the prejudices of their patients. Some point to medical pamphlets warning against acid fruits in the treatment of nervous conditions. Others suggest such warnings were as much about cultural taste as they were about health. You close the door and return to the parlor. The clock ticks in the corner. The air smells faintly of the doctor's gloves, a mix of leather, and the faint medicinal tang of whatever bottles his bag carries. Outside, the tomato vines sway in a wind you cannot quite hear. Inside, your tea has gone cold, but it is still safe to drink. You dress for dinner with the same tidy care you give to sealing a letter. Slow, neat, no flourish beyond what propriety requires. The collar resists at first and then yields. The waistcoat buttons have their own order you never violate. When you finish, the glass returns an image that looks as if it knows how to sit through a long meal without speaking more than necessary. Outside, carriage wheels murmur on the street like someone turning pages 2 houses away. The dining room at your friend's house is already warm when you arrive, the heat banking itself along the wainscot. Candles stand watch in twin ranks, flames cupped by glass chimneys that make their light steadier than you expect. Conversation has begun in the way of a kettle just before the boil quiet, promising not yet in need of a spoon. Coats are taken, gloves disappear into pockets, and chairs accept their owners with the soft thump of upholstery. The table is a geography of confidence. Bread sits in baskets lined with folded linen. Butter has been coaxed into little ridges by a fork's back. The first course appears clear soup, carrying tiny islands of barley and a shy suggestion of parsley. You taste, approve, and find the spoon's bowl fits your mouth as if the maker had measured you. The broth is honest and leaves room for everything that follows. What does not follow, what never follows in this house, is anything scarlet. You realize it anew each time, as if the sight of a table without red were a small magic trick performed solely for your reassurance. Vegetable platters pass in rational colors, leeks pale as winter light, potatoes dignified and matte, carrots that have remembered how to be cheerful without showing off. A salver of cold meats arrives, all gravely pinks and browns. The air smells of cloves, mustard, and roasted fat, nothing sharp enough to suggest fruit that bit back. Your host makes a little speech about the roast to come. He has a fondness for narrating his dinners as they arrive, like a guide conducting a tour of a stately home. A sirloin, he says, done slowly, with suet crust and proper pepper. He nods as if to himself, satisfied. He does not mention sauce, and you cannot help sneaking a glance at the sideboard to confirm what you hope. A row of condiments stands there. Mustard, horseradish, a pot of mushroom ketchup as black as a good secret, and a dish you recognize at once: anchovy sauce, the color of old brass. There is no tomato gravy, no red puree arranged to show modern ideas. You let your lungs empty more completely than you knew they could. A mainstream fact lives easily in your head and rises now like a waiter at the correct moment. In many British dining rooms of the mid-century, mushroom ketchup and brown gravies were common at table, while the tomato, though creeping into cookery books, had not yet achieved the authority of necessity. You have read Mrs. Beaton, and you know she contains tomato recipes. What you also know, and what dinner proves, is that inclusion in a book does not guarantee appearance in a home. Customs walk more slowly than print. The soup plates vanish. A footman brings a dish of something pale and respectable cauliflower, with a crumb top that crunches as gently as footsteps on new snow. You accept, taste, and nod. It is useful, and usefulness is a compliment here. Across from you, a guest with a garden of whiskers speaks softly about rail timetables. The woman to your left confesses that she keeps time sprigs in her gloves case to prevent must. You add the knowledge to your little library of practical things and decide to try it. There is a pause, a small stillness like the drawing of breath before a hymn, and then the roast arrives. It carries with it a plume of heat and the remark everyone expects: "Ah, the carving is neat." Plates travel, hands hover, cutlery rests precisely where manners say it should. You accept a sensible portion and the anchovy sauce. Its salt lifts the beef without asking you to admire it in public. You are grateful for food that does not require comment. At the far end of the table, someone mentions Italy. The word gestures vaguely toward novelty. A gentleman of travel begins describing a dish he was served there. Pasta with a red dressing he pronounces "southe." He explains that it was a sauce of the tomato, like a relish, and he is careful to keep his voice even, as if he were naming an exotic flower with thorns. Your host listens, courteous, perhaps even interested, but no footman moves to produce anything comparable. The table remains loyal to its browns and creams. Between courses, the plate of cress is renewed. You like the way it snaps faintly between the teeth, a kind of whispering freshness that minds its manners. The talk turns to pamphlets. Someone claims to have read that tomato skins, if swallowed, remain indigestible for 3 days. This, offered with the satisfaction of a parlor trick. A fringe tidbit certainly, but one that finds steady employment at dinners such as this. No one at the table provides an experiment to contradict it. The rumor is allowed to sit and warm its hands by the fire of agreement. You watch the host glance, just once, at the row of condiments again, as if checking the perimeter. He raises his glass. The candles catch the wine and make it briefly luminous. Dessert will be puddings and stewed fruits, the civilized sweetness of things that have known heat and sugar long enough to become compliant. You imagine for a moment a dish of fresh sliced tomatoes standing among the custards and jellies, and the image is so out of key that it makes you smile into your napkin, which feels like a small betrayal. The pudding is a proper one, weighty but merciful. Cinnamon behaves itself. Nutmeg does not shout. When the plates are cleared, coffee arrives in cups that look too delicate for the work they do. It smells like decisions made at midnight and kept. You take yours plain and find that it tucks the evening into a neat bundle. The men drift toward the hearth, where pipes will be filled and treated as if they were small, porous clocks measuring satisfaction. You stay at the table for a minute longer, watching the sideboard under its regimen of bottles and bowls. Historians still argue whether the absence of tomatoes from such dinners is proof of fear or simply a portrait of taste. Was it the echo of earlier warnings about nightshades? The practical caution over pewter and glazes? Or did English kitchens prefer their comfort in powders and gravies that had already earned citizenship, leaving red sauces to acquire their papers at a slower desk? The record does not hand over a single answer. It offers menus, receipts, marginalia, and the stubborn fact of what appears when the bell rings for supper. When you stand to go, coats arrive, hats present themselves, and the air at the threshold is the warmest it will be all night. Your host thanks you for bringing an appetite. You thank him for feeding it without argument. On the walk home, the street looks briefly theatrical under a thinning fog. You think of the table you just left. Solid, content, complete, and of its quiet omission. The red fruit remains elsewhere, holding court in its own corner of the century, waiting for an invitation that will eventually come, but not tonight. Back in your kitchen, you set your hat on its peg and regard the larder with the small surveyor's pride of a person who knows what he has and what he will use. Bread is bread, cheese is cheese, and tomatoes are objects in a jar intended for brass. The house exhales. You add water to the kettle for the sake of the evening's final cup and feel your stomach offer the slight, satisfied heaviness that means the hour will behave itself. The day has done nothing remarkable. You prefer it that way. You find yourself in the grocer's shop the next afternoon, mostly because the weather is trying to rain and the narrow doorway offers a momentary shelter. Inside, the air is warmer, edged with the mingled smells of flour sacks, dried currants, and something faintly medicinal from the back shelves. The grocer himself is at the counter, polishing a brass scale pan with the hem of his apron, his head bent in a way that suggests concentration rather than welcome. The front counter holds the ordinary offerings of the week. A neat stack of barley sugar sticks, penny loaves lined like squat soldiers, jars of pickled walnuts floating dark in their brine. Behind him, shelves climb toward the ceiling, loaded with tins and parcels. On one of the lower shelves, your eye catches the curious red of preserved tomatoes, packed in glass jars that magnify their skins until they look almost lacquered. The jars sit between bottled cherries and pickled onions, as if someone hoped proximity to familiar things might make them seem less foreign. The grocer glances up. "Can I get you anything in particular today?" His tone is polite, but there's a flicker in his eyes, the merchant's readiness to steer a customer toward whatever isn't moving quickly enough. You ask for the usual staples: flour, salt, tea. He fills the order with brisk efficiency, weighing and wrapping each parcel in brown paper, tying them with a quick twist of twine. Then he pauses, resting a hand lightly on the shelf just above the jars of tomatoes. "We've got these in from Birmingham," he says almost casually. "Good quality. Put up in the Italian style." You glance at the label. The script is decorative, the letters curling like tendrils. There's a sketch of a tomato plant heavy with fruit, the leaves rendered so green they might be a dare. You thank him but shake your head. He nods as if he expected as much. "Still, they say it's catching on in the cities," he adds, "especially with the younger cooks." His voice holds neither judgment nor enthusiasm, just the factual note of someone who trades in whatever the market wants, even if the market is slow to want it. A mainstream fact is easy to summon here. The canning and bottling of tomatoes had begun to make them more accessible by mid-century, especially for those who could afford imported goods. The process was praised for preserving the fruit's bright color and supposed freshness, but not all were persuaded that boiling and sealing could remove whatever suspicion clung to them. The shop bell jingles as a boy enters, clutching a coin in one hand. He orders a small packet of mustard powder and, unprompted, points to the jars. "Ma says they'll turn your insides sour," he remarks, with the satisfied authority of a messenger repeating orders exactly. The grocer only shrugs. "Your ma's not wrong about some things," he says, handing over the mustard. You remember a fringe tidbit told to you once in a railway carriage that tomatoes, if eaten too frequently, could stain the skin a faint yellow, a mark that supposedly betrayed an intemperate diet. You have never seen such a thing, but the idea lingers in the way of small, improbable warnings that are easy to remember and harder to disprove. The grocer finishes wrapping your parcels and slides them across the counter. You set the coins down, aware of the faint warmth of the shop's air against your hands. Behind you, a woman is asking after treacle. Her voice is familiar enough that you can picture the jar she'll carry home without turning to look. Historians still argue whether the hesitation around tomatoes was fueled more by actual cases of illness, perhaps from poor storage or contamination, or by the collective weight of anecdote, rumor, and repetition. What is certain is that in rooms like this, lined with the products of 100 other places, the red fruit sits in glass, waiting for someone to decide it belongs in the ordinary part of the pantry. You step back out into the lane, parcels under your arm, the faint rattle of paper and twine following you. The rain has not quite committed. It hangs in the air like a decision not yet made. You turn toward home, passing two boys trading marbles by the lamplight. One of the marbles is the exact color of the jarred tomatoes, and for a moment, you imagine the glass breaking, the seeds spilling like small lanterns across the cobbles. Then you shake the thought away and keep walking, glad that the parcels in your arms contain nothing so vivid. Back at home, you take down the household's main cookbook from its shelf above the settle. The spine creaks in the way of a book that has been opened often, but never in haste. Its leather is dark with handling, its corners worn into smooth curves by years of use. You set it on the table and let it fall open where it wants to, somewhere between poultry and puddings. The pages hold the steady hand of a professional printer, recipes arranged in columns, each with a title, a short list of ingredients, and instructions that assume you already know the basic grammar of a kitchen. As your eyes travel down the page, you notice a recipe for stewed mushrooms, one for force meatballs, and another for a rabbit pie. All of it familiar, all of it comfortably brown in the mind. You turn a few more pages. A chapter on sauces appears, and there almost at the bottom of a column is the word tomato. You lean in. It is tomato sauce, spelled with the added A that looks as though it has wandered in from another century. The recipe calls for ripe tomatoes, salt, cayenne, and a generous portion of vinegar. Boil until soft, press through a sieve, and store in bottles. The instructions are brief, confident, and entirely lacking in warning. And yet you notice something. In this entire thick volume, the tomato makes no other appearance. No soups, no salads, no mention among the vegetable dishes. One sauce and nothing more. The rest of the pages return to their parade of mutton, eel, suet, and custard, as if the red fruit had slipped into the book by accident and been politely ignored thereafter. A mainstream fact comes to mind. Even in the mid-Victorian period, many popular cookbooks gave the tomato only a passing mention, often in the context of sauces for fish or meat, rather than as a vegetable in its own right. It was present in print, but not yet present at table in most households. You sit with the book open, fingers idly tracing the margins. In the white space beside the tomato sauce recipe, someone, perhaps decades ago, has penciled a tiny note, good, if taken hot. The handwriting is fine, slanted, and old-fashioned enough to make you wonder which earlier occupant of the house tried it. The remark is so mild it borders on evasive. There is no elaboration, no suggestion of frequency, only the conditional if. Aye. You recall a fringe tidbit told to you at a church fete, that some cooks believed tomatoes should always be served hot because heat would drive out whatever unsettled elements might trouble the digestion. Whether that belief came from medical advice or from the comfort of applying fire to suspicion, you cannot say. The book offers no opinion. It simply holds the recipe and moves on, returning you to the secure terrain of bread puddings and calves, foot jelly. You close it gently, aware that for all the instructions contained within, the book is not a promise, it is a suggestion, and suggestions can be ignored. Historians still argue whether the sparse inclusion of tomatoes in such cookbooks reflected genuine scarcity, or whether it was an editorial bow to fashion, to mention them just enough to appear informed, but not so much as to alienate readers who preferred the familiar. Whatever the reason, your own kitchen remains in line with the majority. The jar on the shelf is for brass, not for supper. You return the book to its place and step back. The room feels much the same as before, but there's a faint hum of thought in it now, the kind that lingers after reading something small, but potentially disruptive. You reach for your tea, finding it only slightly warm, and drink it down without ceremony. The taste is reassuring. Outside the window, the light is dimming into that indistinct hour between afternoon and evening, when the garden begins to blur into shapes rather than details. The tomato patch is just a blot of darker shadow now, its red fruit muted but still there, still waiting, still unchosen. Later that evening, you take a walk through the narrower streets near the docks. The air is thicker here, a mix of coal, smoke, brine, and the sharp tang of tar from the shipwrights' yards. Lamps throw weak circles of light onto the wet cobbles, and in between them, the street is its own kind of dark. You keep a steady pace, not hurried, not lingering, the way people walk when they are known in the area, but not part of its business. Near an alley, you hear a burst of laughter, quick, unpolished, and young. A group of boys stands in a loose knot, caps pushed back, hands busy with something you can't quite see at first. Then one of them lifts a round, bright object to his mouth and bites, juice running freely down his chin. In the flicker of lamplight, the color is unmistakable, a raw tomato, eaten like an apple. You pause. The boy chews with an expression that is neither delighted nor disgusted, just unconcerned. Another boy, thinner and older, takes the next fruit from a tin pail and does the same. The pail holds perhaps a dozen, their skins catching the lamplight like polished lacquer. You step closer, and the boys glance your way with that half-challenging look reserved for strangers who might interfere. "Where'd you get those?" you ask, your tone mild enough to keep it from being a demand. "Off a cart," says the oldest, meaning either a purchase at a discount or something more creative. He grins and wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. "Good for you, mister. Fill you up cheap." He offers one toward you, palm up. You shake your head. A mainstream fact surfaces as you watch them. In poorer districts, tomatoes sometimes found their way into diets earlier than in wealthier homes, often sold cheaply when the supply outstripped fashionable demand. Street vendors would offer them raw, sliced, or in simple sandwiches, with no ceremony and less caution. The boys seem perfectly at ease, though you notice one of them spits a few seeds onto the stones before taking another bite. The youngest crunches through the skin and laughs as juice splatters onto his shirt. Someone makes a joke about red mouths, and they all laugh harder. You recall a fringe tidbit, half remembered from a conversation with a sailor, that in some port towns, tomatoes were thought to stave off scurvy when other fruits were scarce. Whether that was based on real observation or the logic of any fruit is better than none is uncertain, but the belief was strong enough that some captains stocked them when they could. One boy tilts the pail so you can see the last few at the bottom, each with a small bruise or a soft patch. They are not perfect, but they are edible, at least to those without reservations. You think of the jars in the grocer's shop, sitting untouched in neat rows, and contrast them with these hand-to-mouth red globes, consumed without hesitation in the wet chill of the evening. Historians still argue whether the class divide in tomato acceptance was a matter of taste, access, or risk tolerance. In poorer areas, the urgency of filling the stomach often outweighed concerns about unfamiliar produce. In wealthier households, suspicion could afford to be patient. The boys drift away toward the quay, their laughter trailing off into the thrum of the dockside. You continue your walk, the damp air curling around your collar. Somewhere behind you, a tomato skin lies flattened against the cobbles, seeds shining faintly before the next set of footsteps grinds them away. By the time you return home, the streets are quieter, the fog heavier. You hang your coat, light the small lamp on the table, and notice a faint scent of brass polish from the candlesticks, proof that the jar in the kitchen has been opened in your absence. The tomatoes inside are still whole, still sealed in their own suspicion. The studio smells of linseed and dust, of charcoal rubbed into paper, of a slow, invisible rain of pigment that never entirely settles. You enter quietly, as people do in rooms where light is the true host. The tall windows face north, their panes milky with the day's gray. Everything is arranged to please the eye before it thinks. A drape of blue thrown over a packing crate. A pewter jug angled to catch a single ribbon of brightness. A plate set on a pedestal. On the plate sit 3 tomatoes, arranged like a decision postponed. The painter nods you to a chair. Brushes stand bristling in a jam jar, their tips stained in patient gradients of earth and fire. He has already sketched the outline, the jug, the plate, the tomatoes, the blue cloth in a folded triangle, the geometry of calm. He works quietly, breathing as if not to break the air. From time to time he steps back, squints, and then advances again to place a tiny stroke where the world insists on being corrected. You watch the tomatoes more than you watch his hand. They are the most certain thing in the room. Their red is specific, more honest than the paint that would imitate it. Each fruit wears a little star of green at the crown, a reminder of the plant you have refused to eat from. They sit perfectly still, as if proud to have found a use that does not involve forks. The painter clears his throat. They hold the composition, he says, not looking at you. Without them, the jug is only a jug. You believe him. The color pins the eye to the scene, the way a knot secures a line. He lifts a brush, dabs, and then dabs again. Oil takes its time. It asks the painter to match it in patience. A mainstream fact walks tidily into your mind. In the 19th century, still life painting often used fruit as a study in color and form. Apples, grapes, lemons, objects that dallied between the decorative and the edible. Tomatoes, increasingly available, joined the arrangement as models of red, whether or not they were welcomed on the plate at supper. They were dependable sitters, cheap and vivid in a way the eye enjoys. The painter's cat appears and moves through the room like a polite draft, silent, full of intentions you cannot read. It jumps onto a low stool, curls its tail, and watches the tomatoes with the particular scorn cats reserved for things that shine but do not move. You resist the urge to scold as the painter would. The cat is part of the studio's weather. One accepts weather. On the wide sill rests a clutter of reference. A print of an old Dutch arrangement with oysters and lemons. A scrap of paper covered in notations about vermilion and lake. A dried sprig of rosemary. The painter crushes occasionally to persuade the air to be friendlier. He talks a little as he works, about balancing warm with cool, about letting the blue cloth carry the shadow so the tomatoes can claim the light. He does not talk about eating them. It is understood that their usefulness here absolves them of culinary obligation. He pauses to sharpen a pencil with a penknife. The curl of wood peels away in a single ribbon and falls like a quiet road onto the floorboards. "It's the skin," he says, finally glancing at the fruit. It throws a small mirror. You have to watch for it. He holds the brush at arm's length, measuring. A specular highlight. Very small. If you miss it, the red becomes velvet instead of satin. The language of painters is a long way from kitchen talk, and you find it soothing to be led elsewhere. A fringe tidbit comes to you. You once heard that some artists would prick a tomato with a pin to let a drop of juice bead at the cut, so they could study the way transparency sits on color. The thought is oddly surgical, but you can see the appeal. A clear lens of liquid on a red dome, the kind of problem painters like. Whether it improves the picture or merely satisfies curiosity, no one has proved to you. On a side table rests a book open to an engraving of botanical specimens. There is the familiar plate of Solanum lycopersicum, Latin name printed small and officious underneath. The plant looks harmless when reduced to lines and hatchings. The fruit gentle, the leaves decorative. Names in Latin do what they often do. They grant a thing permission to exist on paper without promising anyone will eat it. The painter steps back again, eyes narrowed, and then shifts the plate half an inch. A small earthquake in a quiet universe. The tomatoes comply with gravity and look newly important for their trouble. There, he murmurs to himself, to the cat, to the light. Now they speak to the jug. He wipes his brush on a rag and changes to a thinner point for the rim of the plate, an ellipse that wants to wobble if challenged. You sit without fidgeting. The studio rewards stillness. From the window comes a faint, even light that does not change its mind. You realize how restful it is to be in a room where objects are allowed to be purely themselves. Cloth that is blue, metal that is dull where fingers don't touch it, fruit that is red and round and guilty of nothing except being persuasive. Historians still argue whether the presence of tomatoes in 19th century still life was a sign of their growing acceptance as food, or simply the painter's practical adoption of a strong color that did not bruise under lamplight. Paintings can be evidence, but they are not testimony under oath. They tell you what sat still, not what was served. The painter asks you to tilt the blind a finger width. You do, and the tomatoes gather a new edge of light, a quiet rim that separates them from the cloth. He makes a satisfied sound in his throat, the small approval craftsmen grant when a stubborn corner finally fits. The cat leaps down, rubs itself against your ankle as if apologizing for earlier disdain, and departs again on silent feet. Time performs its usual trick in studios and disappears. When the painter finally sets down his brush, you notice that the tomatoes on the plate have grown a fraction softer at their bottoms. The room is warmer than you realized. They are telling you that time is not only for paintings. You mention it. The painter smiles. "We'll eat them if they collapse," he says lightly, and then, after a beat long enough to be comic, adds, "Or, I'll give them to the cat." The cat, very properly, ignores him. You do not suggest otherwise. The idea of eating what has just performed so well feels like poor manners, like clapping between movements. You prefer to think of them as actors who bow and return to the green room untouched. The plate goes back to its pedestal. The blue cloth keeps its fold. The jug holds its small wedge of borrowed sky. When you leave, the corridor outside smells of turpentine and damp plaster. You carry nothing but a pleasant fatigue born of watching concentration behave itself. Through the stairwell window, you catch a slice of the lane, where a costermonger pushes a barrow piled with cabbages and a modest mound of tomatoes shoved together for intensity. His cry rises, breaks, and fades. No one answers while you are listening. You think, not with urgency but with the gentle curiosity the day permits, that tomatoes enjoy a reputation as models that they have not yet secured as meals. On canvas, they are undeniable. At table, they are still waiting for their story to be decided by spoons. You descend the last stair, step back into air that no one has painted, and feel the world resume its ordinary palette. Brown street, gray sky, the small red insistence tucked politely into the corner of your eye. The Morning Post brings a single letter, its envelope browned at the edges from the long travel, the handwriting wide and confident. You know it is from your cousin in Italy before you even turn it over to check the seal. The stamp shows a cluster of grapes in deep ink, and the postmark carries a name that makes you think of tiled courtyards and laundry strung between windows. You break the seal with a butter knife and unfold the thick paper. The scent of the letter is faint but there, a whisper of olive oil, and the dry air of somewhere sunnier than your street. The first lines are, as expected, a greeting, a polite hope that you are well, the news that the weather there has been most generous to the gardens. And then, almost immediately, she writes about food. She always does. She tells you about the market in her town, where stalls sag under the weight of figs, basil, and tomatoes, so sweet you would think them sugared. She says they eat them daily, sometimes raw with nothing but salt, sometimes stewed with garlic and poured over bread. No one here fears them, she writes. Quite the opposite, we look forward to them as you might look forward to the first strawberries. You pause to let that sink in. In your own kitchen, tomatoes are something to be skirted or preserved for polishing brass. In hers, they are a season's delight. You can almost see her at her table, slicing into one with a small knife, the juice pooling on the plate without anyone worrying about lead or humors. A mainstream fact comes to mind. In Southern Europe, particularly in Italy and Spain, tomatoes were adopted into the cuisine far earlier and more enthusiastically than in Britain. By the early 19th century, they were common in sauces, soups, and salads, with no hesitation about their safety. Geography and climate had a hand in it, but so did habit. Once something is part of the daily table, suspicion fades. Your cousin includes a recipe in her letter, as she often does. This one is for a simple tomato salad. Ripe tomatoes sliced, tossed with olive oil, vinegar, and a scattering of basil leaves. She adds, the bread must be fresh to catch the juices. She writes this as if you could make it tomorrow, as if the ingredients were as ordinary to you as to her. You remember a fringe tidbit a traveler once told you that in some Italian households, tomatoes were thought to, cool the blood in hot weather, the opposite of the Victorian English belief that they overheated it. The same fruit, two entirely different temperaments assigned depending on which side of the continent you stood. She ends the letter with a few lines about the harvest festival, the dances in the square, and a promise to send more recipes whether or not you'll use them. Her handwriting slants cheerfully to the right, the ink fading just slightly where the pen must have paused. You fold the letter carefully and slide it back into its envelope. It feels warmer than the room, as though it has carried a little of Italy's sun with it. On the mantel, there is space where you keep such letters, tucked in a stack bound with ribbon. You place it there, the ribbon loose enough that it could be opened again on a dull day. Historians still argue whether the British reluctance to embrace tomatoes was purely domestic conservatism or a kind of culinary nationalism, the quiet resistance to adopting too much from abroad. Whatever the reason, the same fruit that is welcome in your cousin's kitchen remains, in yours, a guest who has not yet been properly introduced. Outside, the day is overcast, but in your mind you can see a square of sunlit stone, a plate of sliced tomatoes glistening with oil, and bread ready to catch what spills. It is a picture that belongs entirely to another place, yet it sits in your thoughts as if it might be possible here, if only the air would change its mind. The bell over the apothecary's door gives a small, tired ring as you step inside. The air is thick with the mingled scents of dried herbs, ground powders, and something sharp that makes the inside of your nose prickle. Shelves rise along the walls in careful order, each one lined with glass jars stoppered with cork or wax. The light from the front window slants across them, catching motes in suspension. Behind the counter stands Mr. Latham, the apothecary, in his long brown coat. He is sorting dried chamomile into paper packets with a small wooden scoop. Without looking up, he greets you by name, the sort of recognition that is not warm, but is reliable. You ask after a small tin of salve for chapped hands, and he nods, reaching to the shelf without needing to search. The tin appears before you as if by reflex. While he wraps it in paper, his eyes slide toward a jar on the counter. Inside are tomatoes small, firm, and floating in a faintly cloudy liquid that smells faintly medicinal, even through the glass. Not for eating, he says at once, seeing your glance, though there are those who insist otherwise. He rests his palms on the counter, leaning forward a fraction. Boil them well, and you might have a tonic for sluggish digestion. Boil them too long, and you'll ruin their virtue entirely. A mainstream fact presents itself neatly here. In the 19th century, some medical practitioners and apothecaries did experiment with tomatoes as a remedy, believing they could stimulate the liver or aid digestion. Such uses were often presented alongside cautions about quantity and preparation advice that blurred the line between medicine and mistrust. He gestures toward a stack of pamphlets beside the jar. You pick one up. The title reads, "The Tomato, Its Medicinal and Dietary Uses," printed in bold, unornamented type. Inside, the text is a mixture of claims and warnings. Tomatoes invigorate the blood, but may provoke excess of bile. They cool the stomach, but may overchill the constitution. The contradictions are so evenly matched that they cancel one another out. You remember a fringe tidbit from an old neighbor that a poultice of crushed tomatoes could draw the heat from a wasp sting. She swore by it, though she admitted it made the skin smell odd for hours afterward. Whether the relief came from the fruit or simply from applying something cool and damp, you never asked. Mr. Latham shrugs as you replace the pamphlet. "I keep them for those who want them," he says, tapping the jar. "But I've never been in the habit myself." His tone suggests he will not be persuaded otherwise. He counts out your change and slides it across the counter. As you pocket it, you glance again at the tomatoes in their briny suspension. Their skins have dulled slightly, the red tempered by weeks in confinement. They look less like food than like specimens, an exhibit in a museum of curiosities rather than an ingredient for supper. Historians still argue whether such medicinal uses of tomatoes were sincere attempts at integrating them into daily life, or simply another cautious experiment that kept them on the fringes of the kitchen. What is clear is that, here in the apothecary, they remain something apart, a remedy for the curious, not a staple for the table. You thank Mr. Latham and step back into the street. The smell of herbs clings faintly to your coat. mingling with the damp air. Down the lane, a cart passes with a mound of cabbages, and behind them, a shallow crate of tomatoes rocking gently with each wheel's turn. No one stops the cart. The tomatoes keep traveling, as they seem always to do from garden to shop to jar, but rarely to the fork. In the back parlor, while looking for a length of twine, you come across a small drawer that sticks halfway open. The wood swells in damp weather, so it takes a firm tug to free it. Inside are odds and ends that belong to no single category. Old keys without locks, buttons that never matched anything in your wardrobe, a dried sprig of lavender brittle enough to snap at a glance. Beneath the clutter lies a folded paper packet, its edges rubbed soft with age. You lift it out and see, written in a hand you don't recognize, the words, "Tomato seed red." The paper is stained faintly darker in spots, perhaps from damp, perhaps from the oil of what it once contained. It rustles in a way that suggests the seeds are still inside. You ease the packet open. A few tiny seeds spill onto the table, pale, flat, and utterly without menace. They could be the seeds of any small garden plant, indistinguishable without their history. For a moment, you think about what would happen if they were planted here, in the small square of soil behind the kitchen. Would they grow, as the ones in the gardener's corner do, into tall vines heavy with the red fruit you've never eaten? Would you look at them any differently, knowing they had started in your own hand? A mainstream fact slides into place. By the mid-19th century, tomato seeds were available from many seed merchants in Britain, often advertised in catalogs alongside peas, beans, and lettuces. Yet their inclusion in the list didn't always mean they were destined for the dinner plate. Many buyers planted them for ornamental purposes, or to test their hardiness, without the intent of consumption. You turn one seed over with the tip of your finger. It's too small to hold any threat you can measure. You recall a fringed tidbit from an old gardener's tale that planting tomatoes too near potatoes would spoil the earth, as both belonged to the nightshade family and were said to quarrel beneath the soil. Whether this was a gardener's superstition or a practical warning against shared pests, you never determined. The packet itself has a faint, papery scent, mingled with whatever it has absorbed from years in the drawer. A hint of candle wax, the ghost of lavender. You slide the seeds back inside, fold the packet along its original creases, and return it to the drawer. The small clink of a button falling against it feels like a seal on your decision not to disturb its long rest. Historians still argue whether the Victorian reluctance to plant tomatoes widely was based on climate limitations, culinary suspicion, or simply the slow nature of adopting new crops into old routines. The evidence lies in scattered records, seed catalogs, horticultural society notes, and the occasional enthusiastic letter from a gardener who swore his tomatoes were as fine as any melon. You close the drawer carefully so it doesn't stick again. The afternoon light in the parlor has turned a little more golden, catching the dust motes as they shift in the air. Somewhere in the kitchen, you hear the faint clatter of a pot lid. The world moves on around your unopened packet of seeds, content to let them remain a possibility rather than a certainty. As you leave the room, you feel the faint weight of the discovery settle into your mind, not urgent, not insistent, just a small, persistent reminder that some things are kept not to be used, but to be kept. The tomato seeds, like the jars in the grocer's shop and the fruit in the garden, will stay in their place until someone decides to change their story. And today, that someone is not you. The morning newspaper lies folded on the kitchen table, its pages softening at the creases where it has been opened and refolded too many times. You lift it now, settling into a chair near the window where the light falls evenly across the print. The headlines shout of politics and weather, but your eyes skim to the smaller notices, advertisements, and local news tucked between the columns. There, you find an article that catches your attention, a warning about tomato fever spreading in a neighboring town. The language is cautious but alarming, speaking of a mysterious illness with symptoms of fever, nausea, and upset stomachs. The cause is unclear, but tomatoes are named as a possible source, with the suggestion that poor handling or spoiled fruit might be to blame. You read on, noting that the article is careful to disclaim that not all agree on the matter. Some local doctors suggest the fever might be due to contaminated water, or even influenza in disguise. The town council is said to be investigating, urging citizens to exercise caution in their diets until more is known. A mainstream fact arises. During the 19th century, outbreaks of foodborne illness were poorly understood, and unusual symptoms were often attributed to novel or exotic foods like tomatoes. Such reports, whether based on fact or fear, reinforced existing suspicions and slowed the adoption of new ingredients. You fold the paper, the rustle, a soft punctuation to the story. The kitchen is quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, the wind presses against the window panes, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant smoke. A fringe tidbit drifts through your memory, a tale heard once in a village pub, where a man swore that the tomato, when eaten in excess, could cause visions and strange dreams. Whether this was an old wives' tale or a warning meant to discourage reckless eating, you cannot say. The story was told with a half smile, and you suspect it was meant more to entertain than to inform. Historians still argue whether reports like tomato fever reflected genuine health risks or were symptoms of cultural anxiety about new foods. Medical records and newspapers from the time paint a patchwork of fears and facts, with no single narrative to hold them all. You glance again at the clock, feeling the weight of cautious words settling around you like dust. The tomatoes in the garden outside gleam quietly, indifferent to the whispers and warnings, as if waiting for a clearer day when their reputation will no longer be tangled with fear. The tavern smells of damp wood and spilled ale, a comforting heaviness that settles on your shoulders as you push open the door. The low ceiling makes the room feel intimate despite the dozen or so patrons scattered around heavy tables. Lanterns flicker, casting gentle shadows that dance with the murmur of quiet conversations and the occasional scrape of a chair. You take a seat near the hearth, where a small fire glows with steady warmth. The barkeep approaches, wiping his hands on a stained cloth, and asks if you'd care for a bowl of soup. The evening's offering is a rich mutton broth, thickened with barley and seasoned modestly with herbs. You accept, glad for something familiar and warm against the chill outside. The bowl arrives steaming, the scent comforting and steadying. You lift the spoon slowly, savoring the first taste of the broth, gentle, unpretentious, and without surprises. Near the table's edge sits a small tureen, labeled simply as soup of the day. You glance inside, expecting to see a vegetable or perhaps a game stew, but instead find something bright and red. The label reads tomato soup, its handwriting unfamiliar and hesitant. You pose. The bowl is untouched by others. No one has yet dared to sample the bright offering. You look around and see polite avoidance. It is as if the soup carries its own warning, bright as a signal flag. You choose to decline, turning back to your mutton with a small private sigh. A mainstream fact surfaces quietly. Tomato soup was known in some urban areas by the late 19th century, but remained uncommon and often regarded with suspicion by many. Its bright color and unfamiliar taste set it apart from the established fare of gravies and stews. Nearby, a group of men at a corner table discuss the merits of various foods. One argues that tomatoes cause gout, citing a relative who took to them and soon was laid low. Another counters that a friend swears by tomato juice for keeping digestion strong. The argument goes in circles, with no one willing to take the first bite of evidence. You listen, intrigued by the persistence of these stories, how food becomes folklore, each tale adding a layer to the shared fear or favor. A fringe tidbit enters your mind. Some claim that the acid in tomatoes could dissolve lead, which, while a hazard in pewter plates, was used to suggest tomatoes might leach poisons from metalware into the body. This theory, plausible or not, helped cement wariness in many homes. You finish your soup, the warmth spreading through you, and pay your bill quietly. Outside, the rain has begun to fall softly, tapping a steady rhythm on the street. You pull your coat tighter and step into the night, the red glow of the tomato soup still lingering in your thoughts as a reminder of what remains unfamiliar. Historians still argue whether tomato soup's slow acceptance was a matter of taste, health fears, or the simple reluctance to change established eating habits. The truth is layered, like the soup itself, a mixture of fact, fear, and the gradual bloom of trust over time. You attend the lecture in the town hall, a modest room warmed by a cluster of gas lamps that cast a gentle, steady light on polished wood and plain plaster walls. Chairs are set in neat rows, and the audience is a quiet mix of local gentlemen, curious housewives, and a few students who seem eager to learn something new. You settle in among them, folding your hands in your lap and adjusting your coat. The speaker is a botanist from the city, a man with round spectacles and a voice practiced in measured tones. He approaches the lectern with a bundle of papers, glancing over them before beginning. His opening remarks emphasize the wonders of the natural world and the importance of understanding plants not just as food but as medicine, ornament, and curiosity. When he turns to tomatoes, his tone brightens. He describes the plant's origins in the Americas, its family ties to other nightshades, and its remarkable journey across continents. The tomatoes on the table beside him gleam under the lamp bright red, round, and unapologetically vibrant. He insists the tomato is harmless, even beneficial, if properly prepared. It is not poison nor devil's fruit, as some still believe, he declares, meeting the eyes of several in the audience. He recounts the plant's misunderstood reputation, citing studies from botanical gardens and growing experiments in glasshouses that prove its safety and utility. A mainstream fact anchors the lecture. By the mid to late 19th century, scientific opinion increasingly recognized tomatoes as edible and nutritious, but popular acceptance lagged behind academic understanding. The gap between knowledge and custom was wider than many expected. Some members of the audience nod. Others remain reserved. A few whisper among themselves about lingering doubts or personal experiences. One woman mentions a neighbor who suffered digestive troubles after eating tomatoes. The botanist listens patiently and reminds the room that individual reactions vary, but that fear need not govern our tables. A fringe tidbit surfaces during the question period. An old gardener asks whether the tomato's reputed ability to cool the blood applies equally to both fruit and leaves. The botanist replies with a slight smile, suggesting that while folklore often ascribes such qualities, science has yet to find evidence beyond the fruit's nutritional value. The lecture ends with polite applause and the promise of a demonstration of tomato cultivation at the local botanical gardens. As the audience disperses, you linger by the display table, touching the smooth skins of the tomatoes and feeling the coolness beneath your fingers. Historians still argue whether scientific endorsement helped change attitudes toward tomatoes or if social acceptance had to come through slower, more personal encounters. The lecture feels like a moment on that path, earnest, hopeful, but not quite definitive. You leave the hall, stepping into the cool evening, the tomato still vivid in your mind, suspended between suspicion and welcome. You gather in the dim parlor for a quiet evening of cards, the heavy curtains drawn against the chill creeping in from the street. The air smells faintly of wax and pipe tobacco, mingling with the scent of stale hearth ash. The lamp on the table casts a warm circle of light over the worn card deck, its edges softened by years of handling. Around you, friends settle into comfortable positions, fingers nimble from practice. The game is dealt without fuss, and soon the low murmur of voices rises and falls in steady rhythm. Between hands, conversation drifts to topics safe and familiar: the weather, news from the town, and inevitably, food. Someone mentions tomatoes, always the inevitable subject. The group chuckles gently, the laughter edged with the warmth of shared understanding. Tomato eaters, one jokes, are liable to lose their wits. Another offers that he once knew a man who ate them daily and became as red-faced as the fruit itself. The room fills with quiet amusement. You smile inwardly at the familiarity of these jests. The red fruit has become a figure in local humor, a harmless scapegoat for things unexplained, a symbol of eccentricity more than danger. The jokes are not cruel, only mildly teasing, the kind that knit social ties without risking offense. A mainstream fact floats gently into the background. Humor has long been a way to negotiate fear and uncertainty, and tomatoes provided a ready subject for Victorian wit because of their controversial status. From caricatures in newspapers to parlor jokes, they were both feared and laughed about in equal measure. One guest recalls a poem that compares tomato eaters to fruitful fools, and begins to recite it in a sing-song voice. The lines are light-hearted, poking fun without malice, a way to make the unknown feel less threatening. The room listens, some joining in with the refrain. Their voice is soft and even. A fringe tidbit adds a sly twist. A traveler once claimed that in some parts of the country, tomato eaters were thought to be more passionate lovers, their appetite for the fruit seen as a sign of fiery temperament. Whether this was true or merely a joke passed along with a wink, it adds a playful layer to the evening's chatter. You take your turn at the cards, dealing with a careful hand and a steady heart. The game continues, punctuated by laughter and the gentle clatter of chips. Outside, the night holds its breath, and inside, the room feels cozy, a place where suspicion is softened by humor, and fear is kept at bay by shared stories. Historians still argue how much humor helped ease the tomato's path to acceptance, or if it simply marked the boundary between fear and familiarity. Tonight, you think, it is enough that the jokes are kind and the company warm. You fold your cards carefully and prepare for the next hand. The red fruit, a quiet presence in the background of your thoughts, a subject of laughter, not alarm. You enter the conservatory, a room warmed by glass and sunlight, even on days when the sky outside is gray and undecided. The air inside is thick, with the scent of damp earth and growing things, a rich, green perfume that settles in the back of your throat and lingers. Potted plants stand in neat rows on wooden benches, ferns unfurling delicate fingers, orchids nodding heavy heads, and palms stretching toward the light with patient ambition. At the far end, among the exotic collection, stand the tomato plants. They are taller than you expected, their vines climbing thin trellises with the eager strength of youth. Bright red fruit hangs from their branches, glowing in the filtered light like small lanterns. They look less like food here and more like treasures on display, precious and carefully tended. A gardener moves among the plants, pruning a leaf here, adjusting a stake there. He notices your gaze and offers a brief nod. They grow well under glass, he says, protected from the chill, the late frosts. They taste sweeter too, or so I'm told. His tone is matter of fact, but there is a hint of pride in the way he speaks. You watch a few drops of water bead on a leaf and fall to the soil below. The room feels still except for the soft murmur of the gardener's footsteps and the occasional drip. You think about the plants outside, exposed to wind and rain, less sheltered, less coaxed. The tomatoes here seem to wear their color with confidence, a defiance that has not yet crossed the threshold into the kitchen. A mainstream fact settles gently in your mind. The rise of greenhouses and conservatories in Victorian England made it possible to cultivate many plants previously considered too tender for the climate, tomatoes among them. These controlled environments helped shift tomatoes from curiosities to cultivatable crops, though full acceptance on the dining table still lagged. The gardener tells you that some patrons come to see the tomatoes as curiosities rather than food, admiring their shape and color without considering their taste. They are part of the collection, like palms from the tropics or ferns from the highlands, things to study and marvel at, but not necessarily to consume. A fringe tidbit comes to you. A friend once mentioned that in some conservatories, ripe tomatoes were sometimes used to scent the air, their fragrance mingling with the soil and flowers, adding a subtle note of warmth to the cool glasshouse atmosphere. You find the idea oddly fitting, a way for the fruit to contribute without ever being eaten. You linger a moment longer, tracing a finger along the rim of a clay pot, feeling the warmth that the sun has left behind. Outside, the day is uncertain, but here in the glasshouse, the world feels contained, measured, and a little softer. Historians still argue whether greenhouse cultivation accelerated the tomato's acceptance as food or merely reinforced its status as an exotic novelty. The evidence is patchy. Seed catalogs, gardening journals, and occasional references in letters. What is clear is that tomatoes occupied an ambiguous space, both prized and puzzling, ornamental and edible in theory, but hesitant in practice. You step back into the cooler air of the garden and take a breath, the scent of earth and rain greeting you. The tomatoes remain bright in your memory, their color a steady promise of what might one day be welcomed fully at table. A stranger arrives one afternoon, a gentleman with a travel-worn coat and eyes that have seen more roads than most of your acquaintances combined. He carries a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. and the faint scent of something foreign clings to its folds. You meet him at the doorstep, curious and cautiously welcoming. He speaks with a voice that carries the rhythm of distant places. "I've been in Italy," he says simply, "and I brought something you might find interesting." He unwraps the parcel carefully, revealing a small jar of bright red relish, thick and glistening under the afternoon light. The smell is sharp and inviting, the promise of heat and tang clear in the air. He explains that this relish, made from tomatoes, is a staple in the towns he visited, served with bread, cheese, even meats. "It's common there," he says, "something ordinary and beloved." He smiles as if surprised by the simplicity of it all. "I thought you might like to try it before the century turns." You hold the jar in your hands, feeling the weight of something both new and strangely familiar. The label is handwritten, the ink faded but legible. You can almost hear the sounds of the Mediterranean in its name, the clatter of markets, the calls of vendors. A mainstream fact comes to mind. By the late 19th century, tomato-based relishes and sauces had become common in Mediterranean diets and were beginning to influence tastes elsewhere, thanks in part to increased travel and trade. However, their adoption in British kitchens was still gradual and often met with suspicion. The stranger offers a slice of bread and a knife. You spread a small amount of the relish, the bright color vivid against the pale crumb. The taste is unexpected, sweet, sharp, with a hint of spice. It is unlike anything you have tried, and yet it feels like the start of something. A fringe tidbit floats up from memory. Some travelers spoke of tomato relish as a remedy for melancholy, a way to brighten both the palate and the spirit during long, damp winters. Whether that was true or simply a poetic invention, it adds a layer of warmth to the new taste. You take another bite, slower this time, letting the flavors settle and unfold. The jar feels heavier in your hands, the contents more significant than you expected. The stranger watches, patient, waiting to see your verdict. Historians still argue whether such introductions by travelers truly shifted British tastes or merely planted seeds of curiosity that took decades to grow. The story of the tomato is not just about food, but about connection, the way new flavors travel with people and linger in memory before arriving on the table. You thank the stranger and promise to think on his gift. As he leaves, the afternoon light softens, casting long shadows and coloring the world in gentle gold. The jar rests on your kitchen shelf, a bright note waiting for its moment. You catch the kitchen maid one afternoon, a moment stolen between chores, as she hovers near the pantry door with a small piece of bread in hand. Her eyes flicker nervously when she notices you watching, and she takes a quick bite before tucking the rest behind her back as if hiding a treasure. Curiosity wins over discretion. You ask what she's eating, and she glances about before whispering, "Tomato." The word feels almost taboo. She pulls from her apron a thin slice of the red fruit, placed carefully atop the bread, like a secret spread. She explains that when the cook is not looking, she sometimes sneaks a taste of tomatoes, drawn by the fruit's sweetness and the sharpness that contrasts with the dull routine of bread and butter. It is her small rebellion, a private pleasure in a world of strict rules and measured portions. A mainstream fact is easy to recall. Servants in Victorian households often had limited access to fresh and varied food, relying on scraps or small allowances. The allure of forbidden foods like tomatoes could be both a comfort and a symbol of autonomy in a constrained life. You watch her eat slowly, savoring the combination without haste, as if stretching the moment of indulgence. The kitchen is quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the distant clatter of dishes. She wipes her mouth on the back of her hand and meets your eyes with a brief, shy smile. A fringe tidbit surfaces. Some servants believe that eating tomatoes could lend a glow to the skin or a brightness to the eyes, small advantages in a life often lived out of sight. Whether these beliefs were based in truth or hope is uncertain, but they added to the fruit's mystique. You nod thoughtfully, understanding that the tomato carries meanings beyond the kitchen, small acts of enjoyment, moments of freedom, tastes that connect the humble to the exotic. The maid slips the remaining bread and tomato slice back into her pocket, and you let her go with a gentle nod. Historians still argue how much household hierarchy influenced tomato consumption, with servants often leading the way in adopting new foods before their masters. The records are sparse, but suggest that behind closed doors, the red fruit held a quieter, more personal significance. You return to your own tasks, the image of the maid's secret snack lingering. Outside, the day moves on, steady and unremarkable. But inside, the tomato carries a hidden story, one of desire and discretion, of small joys tucked away from view. You find a small pamphlet slipped beneath the door one afternoon. Its paper crisp and faintly fragrant with the smell of printed ink and dust. The cover reads American Receipts, New Uses for the Tomato, the title promising novelty and distant kitchens. You settle into your chair to read, curious about a world so different from your own. The pamphlet offers recipes that sound strange and enticing. Tomato pie, stewed tomatoes with spices, and even a dish called tomato toast, where the fruit is mashed and spread over buttered bread. The instructions are simple, meant for cooks who are adventurous or eager to try the new. The language is earnest and inviting, suggesting the tomato as a fruit of possibility rather than suspicion. You notice the pamphlet's tone is subtly different from British cookbooks, more welcoming, less cautious. The tomatoes are presented as common, even essential. In American households, a staple rather than a curiosity. The contrast is striking and makes you wonder how much geography shapes what ends up on the plate. A mainstream fact stands firm. By the late 19th century, tomatoes had become integral to many American dishes, their use well established in the kitchens of cities and farms alike. This widespread acceptance influenced, over time, culinary trends in other English-speaking countries, though at a slower pace. You imagine the cooks who first tried these recipes, women working by wood stoves, their hands seasoned by years of preparation, willing to give the unfamiliar a chance. You think about the journeys these recipes took across oceans, carried by letters, books, and the whispers of travelers. A fringe tidbit floats up from memory. An American traveler once told you that some households use tomato pie as a way to impress guests, a dish both savory and sweet, unexpected and refined. Whether it was common or a showpiece, the idea lingers as a symbol of culinary confidence. You fold the pamphlet carefully and set it aside. Its pages hold a world where tomatoes are friends rather than foes, companions at the table rather than ornaments in the garden. The possibility feels both distant and tantalizing. Historians still argue how much influence American culinary practices had on British tastes, and whether pamphlets like this were read widely or kept mostly in the hands of the curious few. The story of the tomato's journey is a slow one, marked by hesitation and hope in equal measure. Outside, the light fades softly, casting long shadows that mingle with the quiet of the evening. The tomatoes in your own garden are dim shapes now, waiting, as always, for the moment when they might be more than just fruit. You slip into the tavern just as dusk softens into night, the warmth of the fire greeting you like an old friend. The room is filled with a low murmur of voices, the steady rhythm of mugs lifted and set down, and the occasional burst of laughter that echoes off the wooden beams. The scent of roasted meat and spilled ale hangs thick, a comfort against the chill outside. You take a seat at a corner table, where a group of men are engaged in a lively debate. Their topic is familiar: tomatoes. One man, red-faced and stout, insists they are the cause of gout, describing in vivid detail how his cousin was laid low after a tomato-heavy season. Another, lean and keen-eyed, counters that a friend swears by tomato juice for keeping the digestion strong and the spirits high. The argument is circular, with neither side willing to concede, and the room listens with the polite interest reserved for well-worn controversies. You sip your ale slowly, the warmth spreading through your chest and easing the tension of the day. A mainstream fact is evident here. Tomatoes had become a subject of popular medical debate, their effects on health uncertain and often contradicted by anecdote. Such disputes contributed to the fruit's slow acceptance and the patchwork of attitudes that varied by region and social class. You catch a fringe tidbit amid the discussion. One man claims that tomatoes, if consumed excessively, can cause skin to take on a faint yellow tint, a sign, he says, of too much fruit in the blood. The others laugh this off, but the story lingers, a curious superstition passed from mouth to ear. The talk turns to recipes, with mentions of sauces and stews, though none professes to have tasted a tomato soup. Instead, the men speak of gravies rich with mushroom ketchup and mustard, sauces that have proven their worth over time. The tomato remains the outsider, acknowledged but untrusted. You glance around the room, taking in the flicker of firelight on faces lined with work and worry, the slow swirl of smoke curling toward the ceiling. The tomatoes, bright red in your mind, feel far away, a foreign thing to this familiar, earthy place. Historians still argue whether the debate over tomatoes in such taverns influenced public opinion or simply reflected existing divisions. What is certain is that these conversations were part of a larger story about food, health, and trust in a changing world. You finish your ale and stand, stepping into the cool night air. The streets are quiet, the fog thicker now, softening edges and swallowing sounds. You pull your coat tighter, thinking of the tomatoes left behind in their gardens and jars, waiting for a day when such debates might no longer be necessary. The doctor you met before visits again, this time with a small glass bottle in hand and a look of cautious optimism. He sets the bottle on the table and uncorks it with a quiet pop. Inside is a thick, red liquid tomato juice, freshly pressed and strained. He explains that recent medical thought suggests tomato juice can be beneficial for sluggish digestion and restoring the blood. He encourages you to try a small glass daily, prepared fresh and taken in moderation. His tone is measured, carefully balancing recommendation with caution. You pour a small portion and raise it to your lips. The taste is sharp and earthy, a hint of sweetness caught in the acidity. You swallow slowly, noting the warmth that follows and the unfamiliar sensation of something new working within. A mainstream fact appears. By the late 19th century, some physicians began prescribing tomato juice as a tonic, though it remained controversial and far from universally accepted. These early endorsements helped shift perceptions, but skepticism lingered in both medical and popular circles. You remember a fringe tidbit shared by a friend, that tomato juice was sometimes used to calm nerves and reduce headaches, though it was said to cause heat in the blood if taken too often. The balance of benefit and risk was delicate, and advice varied widely. The doctor smiles as you finish the glass. Keep it up for a week, he advises, and note any changes. He departs, leaving you with the bottle and a quiet hope that this new experiment might prove worthwhile. Historians still argue whether these early medical endorsements genuinely influenced tomato acceptance, or if they merely added another layer of uncertainty. The line between medicine and myth remained thin, and tomatoes lingered on the cusp of trust. You place the bottle on the kitchen shelf, beside the jars and packets that tell their own stories of caution and curiosity. Outside, the evening deepens, and the tomatoes in the garden grow quiet beneath the watchful moon. Your neighbor has converted the lean-to at the back of his property into a greenhouse, its glass panes catching the afternoon light like a jewel box. He invites you to see his latest project, tomato plants thriving in this sheltered world, away from frost and rain. You step inside, the air warmer here, thick with the scent of damp earth and growing things. The vines climb slender trellises, their leaves glossy and deep green, fruit hanging like ripe beads, glowing with a promise that seems both familiar and new. He speaks with pride about the difference the glass makes, how the tomatoes ripen earlier, taste sweeter, and avoid the bruises of the outdoor garden. They're safer this way, he says, and I think the flavor suits the table better. You touch a tomato, its skin taut and cool beneath your fingers. The room feels like a small sanctuary for the fruit, a place where it is nurtured and protected until it is ready to shed suspicion and be welcomed as food. A mainstream fact settles easily. The rise of greenhouses in Victorian England allowed for earlier and more reliable tomato cultivation, helping to change their reputation from fragile novelty to dependable crop. These structures were symbols of progress and control over nature. He shares a fringe tidbit. Some gardeners believe that tomatoes grown under glass carry a subtle sweetness not found in those grown outdoors, a secret prize for those patient enough to nurture them through winter's edge. Whether true or not, the idea adds to their mystique. You breathe in the warmth and the scent of earth, feeling the slow shift in the story the tomatoes tell from feared fruit to cultivated companion. The neighbor's enthusiasm is infectious, and you find yourself imagining what it might be like to harvest from this sheltered space. Historians still argue whether greenhouses were a turning point in tomato acceptance or simply a niche improvement for the wealthy. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a combination of horticultural innovation and gradual cultural change. You step back outside, the cooler air greeting you, and look once more at the vines heavy with fruit. They're red now, a little less distant, a little more possible. You arrive at the summer fair with the easy stride of someone who expects to be asked for nothing more than a small coin and a patient smile. The field is bright and busy, tents blooming like canvas flowers, bunting lifting and falling in the mild breeze. A brass band is nursing a march in the shade, trying not to look like it minds, playing it again. Children run channels through the grass, leaving flattened paths that the afternoon will forgive. The air tastes of dust, sugar, and frying fat, a polite confusion of scents that feels more festive than any one perfume would on its own. You move past the stalls that always greet you, first hoops over pegs, coconuts that never quite fall, gingerbread men with currant eyes that look surprised at their own existence. A barrel organ coughs out its tune. A woman sells lemonade, cloudy with pith. A man balances a tray of boiled sweets and calls them by names that seem older than he is. You let the crowd carry you along until a patch of color presses itself onto your attention. A trestle table with a white cloth, upon which lie neat rows of red slices, glistening as if recently baptized. A hand-painted board makes its case in tidy letters. Tomato tastings, try a slice. The word tastings feels foreign, as though it has borrowed its grammar from wine and decided to behave accordingly. A young woman stands behind the table, sleeves rolled, hair in a coil that has loosened just enough to seem inviting rather than careless. She smiles without insisting. You stop at a measured distance. The slices are set on small plates in a fan, the seeds catching light like tiny droplets of amber. A shallow dish of salt sits nearby, along with another of pepper ground fine enough to look like soot. The woman lifts a slice with a small fork and asks, as if offering little more than a raisin, "Will you try?" Her voice is ordinary in the nicest way, an invitation to be briefly curious and then forgiven if you are not. Your mouth answers before your caution finds its footing. "A small one," you say, and she obliges, setting a thin crescent on a plate and adding the barest pinch of salt, which dissolves as quickly as a promise. You take the plate, feeling the slight flecks of tin beneath your fingers. The slice quivers politely. You bring it to your mouth with the deliberate pace of someone approaching a boundary stone. The skin gives with the faintest resistance, a pleasant, almost ceremonial break. The flesh is cool, slick, and not at all aggressive. The first impression is water made interesting, then a soft sweetness, and finally a clean tang that does not linger rudely. You had expected a scold. You receive a greeting. You take another bite because etiquette, once engaged, should be completed. A mainstream fact rides in with the gentlest authority. By the later decades of the 19th century, public fairs and seaside resorts increasingly featured sample tables and refreshment stalls, where new foods could be tasted for a penny, tomatoes among them. These encounters helped many people meet the fruit without the pressure of adopting it at home. The fair, you realize, has lent you a brief permission to be modern for a mouthful. The woman tilts the salt dish toward you. "A whisper more?" she asks. You nod, and the second bite becomes rounder, as if the salt had taught the slice how to speak in a fuller tone. You do not swoon with revelation. You do not convert on the spot, but a small suspicion in you, long employed and proud of its position, requests an afternoon off. She tells you, conversationally, that the tomatoes were grown under glass by her uncle, that they're sliced only as needed, that people often ask for pepper, though she prefers the plain company of salt. A fringe tidbit escapes her with a chuckle. Some customers insist on a dusting of sugar, just a breath, claiming it makes the fruit taste like sunshine. You cannot decide whether the thought is charming or indecent, but you allow it to sit near you without argument. A man beside you performs a short play of bravado, declaring that he's eaten tomatoes abroad and lived to boast of it. He takes 2 slices, salts them like a road in sleet, and swallows with theatrical satisfaction. A child behind him asks for a very small piece and then gives half of it to a doll with a china face. The doll bears it with outstanding composure. Somewhere behind you, someone says, "Well, if they're giving them away, and then laughs in a way that means they have decided to live dangerously at negligible expense. You stand a moment longer, conscious of your tongue learning a new, mild map. You realize, with a pocket of quiet surprise, that nothing in you is offended. Your stomach offers no protest. Your head remains your own. You can feel, if not a change of heart, then at least a loosening of its laces. The woman offers a recipe as easily as a napkin. Slice thin, salt. Leave them 10 minutes. Then lay on bread with a little oil if you have it. If not, butter will do. Don't be clever. Her advice sounds like sense dressed for the day. You imagine the kitchen at home, the knife that is sharp enough for onions being more than equal to this task. You imagine not hiding the plate when someone knocks. Historians still argue whether moments like these public tastings, travel recollections, a cousin's letter carried in a pocket did more to normalize tomatoes than did any cookbook or lecture. Was it the fair's easy democracy, where a penny could buy a trial without commitment, or the slow endorsement of domestic servants and gardeners that turned the tide? The record is friendly to theories and stingy with conclusions. You thank the woman, pay your small coin, and are given a second slice without needing to ask. This one you take more boldly, letting the salt sit on your tongue before the fruit arrives to meet it. The combination feels practical rather than daring. A conversation that knows not to overstay. On the edge of the table, a card reads, Tomato relish jars, 3D. You do not reach for a jar, not yet, but you do not flinch at the thought that one might someday live on your shelf and be opened on purpose. You step away and find the band attempting a waltz it does not entirely trust. A dog trots past carrying a sausage that cannot possibly be his. The clouds make shallow mountains and then forget them. You stand in the unremarkable brightness of mid-afternoon and take stock. You have eaten a tomato in public, and the world has declined to rearrange itself in response. On your walk home through the softened track marks of cartwheels, you keep tasting, the way the mouth keeps reading a letter already folded away. The aftersense is faintly sweet, faintly green, a memory without an agenda. You glance over a hedgerow at a garden where tomato vines hang like a pause in conversation. You find that you do not look away so quickly. At home, you rinse a plate and set it to dry with more care than it needs. Your hand, almost without consulting you, checks the cupboard for a clean pinch of salt. You do nothing with it now. It is enough to know that you might. The late sun stops at the sill and considers your kitchen, then moves along. You let your shoulders loosen and your thoughts idle. You have not betrayed your habits. You have merely borrowed a small, permissible curiosity from a sunny table in a noisy field. That seems a safe debt to carry. You wake the next morning expecting, if not trouble, then at least some faint reminder that you crossed a line yesterday at the summer fair. A heaviness in the stomach, perhaps, or a restless night's ledger still open in your head. Instead, you find yourself much the same as ever. Joints a little stiff from sleep, mouth dry from the night air, mind idling in its usual slow circle. No fever, no ache, no odd dreams about Mediterranean harbors. You rise, wash, and dress without hurry. The kettle hums as it always does. The bread gives its soft sigh when you slice it. The tea tastes exactly like tea. You begin to suspect that the tomato, at least in the cautious quantity you dared, has left no mark at all. Neither harm nor miracle. A mainstream fact arrives without effort. Gradual exposure often played a role in the adoption of once feared foods. Many who first tried tomatoes did so in small amounts, noting the absence of ill effects before allowing them a more regular place on the table. Suspicion, like frost, requires several warm days to begin receding. You glance at the small paper of salt you brought home from the fair, folded neatly as if waiting for the same experiment to be repeated. It sits beside the breadboard, entirely unthreatening. You think of the woman at the stall, the quiet confidence of her slices, and wonder if she has converted others before you. A fringe tidbit drifts into mind. An acquaintance once claimed that tomatoes, taken in moderation, settle themselves in the blood and improve one's mood for the day. You cannot say whether your own good humor this morning is due to yesterday's slice or to the fine weather that has arrived after several damp days, but the effect is agreeable either way. The garden outside is still damp with early dew. You can see the tomato patch in the far corner, the fruit bright against the dark soil. It no longer feels entirely like enemy territory. You are not yet ready to step into it, but you find your gaze resting there more often, as if the red has begun to carry an invitation instead of a warning. Historians still argue whether acceptance of tomatoes in Britain was driven more by repeated personal experience or by shifts in public discourse, recipes appearing in trusted cookbooks, endorsements from physicians, glowing reports from abroad. Likely, it was both, a slow dance between private trial and public reassurance. You finish your tea and set the cup aside, the taste of tannin lingering faintly. Outside, a cart rattles past with a load of cabbages, and somewhere beyond the hedge a bird gives a note so brief it feels like a punctuation mark. You do not rush into anything new today. You simply keep the door a little more open in your mind. The salt remains on the board, the bread beside it, and though you do not reach for a tomato, you acknowledge quietly that the idea no longer feels like trespass. The change comes quietly, as most changes do, not with a declaration, but with the simple fact of a plate set before you. It is dinner at a neighbor's house, a modest gathering of 6, the sort where conversation is polite and the table is orderly. The roast beef sits at the center, flanked by the expected potatoes, greens, and a brown gravy in a boat. And then there is the sauce, red, smooth, and warm, served in a small porcelain dish with a silver spoon resting neatly inside. No one announces it. No one warns against it. It is simply there, as though it had always been part of the landscape. When the dish reaches you, you hesitate just long enough to feel it. The sauce gives off a gentle steam, carrying a smell that is faintly sweet and faintly sharp, familiar enough from yesterday's slice that it no longer feels foreign. You take a spoonful, not large, letting it pool beside the beef. It spreads slowly, touching the edge of the potatoes like someone making introductions. The first bite is careful. The beef is tender, the sauce warm against it, the combination richer than expected. You had thought the tomato might stand apart, insisting on its own presence, but instead it seems to fold itself into the meat's flavor, deepening it without demanding attention. A mainstream fact takes its seat at the table. Tomato sauce was among the earliest ways the fruit found acceptance in British kitchens, often used as a condiment for meat or fish, where its sharpness could be tempered by cooking and seasoning. In this form, it could pass as merely another member of the sauce family, its history hidden in the blending. Conversation continues around you about railway timetables and the price of coal. The sauce is passed again without comment, spoon clinking lightly against porcelain. No one appears to be taking notes on who accepts and who declines. It is simply part of the meal, and that normality feels almost strange in itself. A fringe tidbit surfaces. You once heard that some cooks added a pinch of sugar to tomato sauce, not only for flavor, but to reassure diners by softening the fruit's acidity. A small concession to caution dressed as seasoning. Whether today's dish carries such a sweetness, you cannot quite tell, but the balance is pleasing. Historians still argue whether such quiet introductions, a sauce folded into a familiar dish, did more for the tomato's acceptance than any lecture or printed recipe. What is certain is that in this moment, with your fork in hand, the red fruit no longer feels like an intruder. You finish your portion without drama, noticing only that the plate returns to the kitchen with less hesitation than you might have imagined. The sauce dish is nearly empty by the end of the meal, and no one remarks on it. When you step out into the cool night air afterward, the taste lingers not as a challenge, but as something comfortably absorbed into the evening. The moon is low, and the tomato, for the first time in memory, feels like a thing that might belong. The tomatoes arrive at your table, the way new neighbors plant themselves into a street, not with fanfare, but with curtains drawn and a polite nod when you happen to meet. They do not announce themselves as a revolution. They appear in the small corners first. A spoonful of relish beside cold beef, a slice tucked discreetly into a sandwich that someone labels refreshing rather than new, a quiet wedge folded into a salad where lettuce and cress shoulder most of the responsibility. The kitchen does not argue with you about it, nor do you argue with the kitchen. On a weekday, your plate holds a tidy arrangement: boiled potatoes, a sliver of ham, a neat line of pickles, and there, almost shyly, a spoon of tomato chutney you do not remember asking for. It smells of vinegar and a little spice. You taste, you nod, No one watches to see if you survive. Later, you find a note in the housekeeper's hand. Received 2 jars from Mrs. Perry. There is no mention of novelty, only provenance, as though tomato jars have always moved along the friendly lanes of borrowing and return. At breakfast, a slice slips into the sandwich that used to be only bread and cheese. The first bite has that cool, patient sweetness you remember from the fair, subdued by the fat of the cheese, improved by the scrape of mustard. You chew and think how mild the change feels, not an argument, just an edit. If anyone asks how the sandwich was, you say, satisfactory, which in your house is praise. A mainstream fact takes its seat politely. By the late 19th century, tomato condiments, ketchups, chutneys, relishes had become steadily more common in British homes, not always prepared from fresh fruit, but often purchased in bottles and jars. Their presence let the tomato enter the meal dressed as a seasoning rather than a guest of honor, which suited cautious palates. Printed advertisements promised brightness, digestion, and improvement to meats that had long kept their own counsel. In the larder, a bottle labeled tomato catsup stands near the familiar mushroom kind, its color a promise that does not need to be read aloud. You notice the bottle level fall over a fortnight without remembering any particular meal at which you reached for it. The change has chosen anonymity. You do not mind. It is easier to accept a new regularity if it behaves like an old one. At luncheon with a friend, you observe the dance of denial in its natural habitat. He serves mutton, potatoes, a simple salad, and a little dish of red sauce. When you compliment the balance of flavors, he replies, "Oh, that old thing," as if the sauce has been in his household since the flood. "My cook insists on it," he adds, pushing the responsibility to a safe distance while retaining the benefit. You recognize the maneuver because you have performed it yourself. Adoption without admission, accommodation without confession. A fringe tidbit adds itself with a smile you keep to yourself. Someone in the Music Society claims that tomato eaters sing a half-tone brighter because the blood steps livelier. The statement is delivered with such cheerful certainty that you cannot bring yourself to disagree, though no rehearsal has yet provided measurable proof. Still, you notice the choir mistress has taken to providing sandwiches with a single tomato slice at the tea interval. Perhaps she believes in half-tones, or perhaps she believes in morale. Either way, the sopranos appear pleased. Your own kitchen grows bolder in ways that feel modest. A stew comes to table, with a depth you cannot quite name until the cook mentions, when asked directly, that she put in 1 red one and let it go to pieces. She says it the way one might say a window was cracked to freshen the air. You nod once and keep eating, grateful for the honesty and for the restraint. Historians still argue whether this phase, the period when tomatoes appeared often but were rarely celebrated, marks the true hinge of acceptance. Was it the condiment path, the stealthy spoonfuls that did the necessary work? Or was the groundwork laid by glass houses and lectures and letters from abroad, so that a household was only waiting for an excuse to stop being theatrical about it? The answer seems, like most domestic truths, to prefer privacy. Diaries and bills speak softly. Menus tell you what was served, not how anyone felt about it. In the grocer's shop, the jars no longer stand like unclaimed parcels from foreign stations. They move. You see a woman you recognize from church reach for 2 without hesitation, and in the queue, a boy asks whether there will be more when the ships come. The shopkeeper answers as if he were discussing salt or soap. Tomatoes have joined the language of supply. At home, you practice small courtesies with your appetite. When a dish bears tomato, you neither announce approval nor perform endurance. You let it be the thing it is, a flavor that now lives among the other flavors. If asked later about the meal, you say, "Yes, that was well done," and only sometimes add, "The red sauce was useful." The word useful has, of late, begun to carry a warmth it did not always possess. On a walk, you pass gardens where vines under glass look confident, and others where outdoor stems, less cosseted, still manage enough fruit to feed a household that has decided to be reasonable about it. You notice more tomato skins in the rubbish on collection day, their red dulled by paper and dust. Refuse tells a truer story than talk. The neighborhood has begun to eat what it once narrated. In the evening, you receive a note from your cousin in Italy. She writes that the summer has been generous and encloses a pressed basil leaf. It's sent only a memory now. You will find your own way with them. She writes of the tomatoes, as if counseling patience rather than persuasion. You hold the paper to your nose and catch a shadow of green. It feels like being told a secret you already half knew. There are still boundaries. Tomato does not arrive at breakfast as often as jam. It does not take command of the Sunday roast. It behaves, in your house, as a good guest who learns the seating plan. Yet there is no longer a jar specifically assigned to brass, not because the metal does not need brightening, but because the kitchen has stopped confusing the tool with the table. The candlesticks now receive their shine from something made for the purpose, and the tomatoes receive theirs from the light when sliced. Sometimes you think of the first time you try to slice at the fair, the small plate, the pinch of salt, the mild astonishment of nothing going wrong. You have since discovered that most things change like that. A quiet, perhaps, a few repetitions, the removal of commentary. The world grows new habits while pretending it never had old ones. No one confesses, no one is required to. One afternoon, you make a sandwich for yourself. Bread, a sensible cheese, a thin layer of mustard, and a single, careful slice of tomato. You salt it lightly because you remember the woman's advice not to be clever. You sit by the window and eat, watching the garden refuse to choose between sun and cloud. The sandwich is neat, cool, and obedient. It does not ask to be remarked upon. You are grateful for food that does its work and leaves the appetite in a respectable mood. The day ends with the ordinary comfort of a tidy kitchen. Knives are wiped, the board is rinsed, the bottle levels make slow, comprehensible descents. On the sill, 2 tomatoes rest on a saucer, not a threat, not a sermon, only tomorrow's convenience. If someone were to ask whether you like them, you might say, "They are agreeable," and find that the word lands exactly where you meant it to. In the ledger of your habits, a line has been rewritten without scratching out the old one. Both lines remain legible if you are inclined to look closely. You are not. It is enough that the table feeds you and that your reluctance has learned to sit down without speaking. The red fruit has found its place by offering to be helpful, and you have accepted the offer without writing a speech about it. Years pass, and the tomatoes no longer surprise you. They arrive in the kitchen basket alongside onions and carrots, bought without comment from the grocer. They appear at table in sauces, sliced into sandwiches, or baked gently with herbs, the way one might prepare any other sensible vegetable. Their color no longer announces danger. It simply joins the meal's arrangement, like a guest whose name is on the seating plan. You think back to the years when their presence would have been remarkable, the way your eye would linger in the garden on that patch of bright red, the way stories of tomato fever or pewter poisoning could stir a room. Those conversations have thinned, replaced by mild observations about the weather, the price of coal, or the thickness of the cream this week. If tomatoes are mentioned at all, it is to ask where they were grown, or whether the season has been kind to their sweetness. A mainstream fact feels almost quaint now. Once feared for their supposed effects on health, tomatoes became, by the end of the 19th century, an ordinary part of the British table. Cookbooks began to feature them regularly. Market stalls sold them without needing to persuade. The transformation was quiet but complete. You remember a fringe tidbit from long ago, someone's claim that tomato eaters sang half a tone brighter. You smile at the thought, realizing it has been years since you heard it repeated. Perhaps the story was retired when the novelty wore off. Or perhaps it simply lost its humor when the fruit became too familiar to joke about. Historians still argue whether the tomato's acceptance came from persistent advocacy by gardeners and physicians, the influence of foreign travel, or the steady erosion of suspicion through small, repeated encounters. You suspect it was all of these, braided together in the ordinary way of human change. A little proof, a little curiosity, and the slow fading of resistance. The garden still grows them each summer, though they no longer sit apart like curiosities. They share space with beans, lettuces, and herbs, and they are harvested as casually as the rest. On the windowsill, a few ripen in a bowl beside the bread, waiting for a salad or a stew. Their skins catch the light without ceremony, and no one notices except perhaps you. remembering when they were a subject worth an evening's debate. You take a slice with your lunch, just bread, cheese, and a little salt, and eat without thinking of history or health. It is mild, fresh, and as unremarkable as you could hope for. The fact that it is unremarkable feels, in its own way, like the conclusion of a long, quiet story. You lie back down in the stillness of the afternoon, the window open to a faint garden breeze. The air smells of earth and warm stone. In the distance, you hear the slow creak of a cart and the occasional call of a bird. Your stomach is at ease, your mind unhurried. The tomatoes are just food now, neither suspect nor savior, and that, perhaps, is the most peaceful ending they could have found. End of script. Sweet dreams.